Nero Wolfe and the Treasure of the Dead Monks. It was a grey Monday morning in October when the trouble walked through our door, clutching what looked like a piece of medieval parchment and wearing the kind of nervous expression that usually means someone's about to die. I was at my desk in the office of the old brownstone on West 35th Street, typing up Wolfe's orchid germination records, a task about as thrilling as watching paint dry in a coal mine, when the doorbell rang. Fritz was busy in the kitchen preparing Wolfe's breakfast, and Wolfe himself was upstairs in the plant rooms communing with his cattleyas, so I answered the door myself. Standing on the stoop was a thin woman in her 50s, grey-haired and sharp-featured, with the kind of intense eyes that suggested she'd spent too many years staring at old books by candlelight. "Mr. Goodwin?" she asked, her voice carrying a slight tremor. "That's me, and you are?" "Dr. Margaret Ashford, from the Medieval Studies Department at Columbia. I need to see Mr. Wolfe immediately. It's about murder." I gave her the standard spiel about appointments and Wolfe's sacred schedule, but she interrupted me by pulling a rolled parchment from her leather satchel. "This is why someone tried to kill me last night," she said, holding up the document, "and why they succeeded in killing Professor Hendrik van Der Berg yesterday evening. That got my attention." I ushered her into the office and offered her the red leather chair. She perched on its edge like a bird ready to take flight, still clutching her parchment. "Tell me about it," I said, settling behind my desk. 3 days ago, Professor van der Berg contacted me about this manuscript. He claimed it was genuine, 13th century, from the monastery of San Marcos in northern Spain. It contains references to what he called the treasure of the dead monks, a cache hidden when the monastery was sacked in 1248. "And you believed him?" I was skeptical at first, naturally, but Hendrik was brilliant, Mr. Goodwin, one of the foremost medieval scholars in the country. When he showed me this document, she unrolled the parchment carefully. The language, the script, the parchment itself, everything appeared authentic. I leaned forward to look. The writing was in what I assumed was Latin, with illuminated letters and margin decorations that looked old enough to vote. There were also strange symbols scattered throughout the text, circles, triangles, and what looked like crude maps. "So what's the problem?" I asked. "Yesterday morning, Hendrik called me, extremely agitated. He said he'd decoded part of the manuscript and discovered something extraordinary. He wanted to meet with me at his apartment that evening to show me what he'd found. When I arrived," she shuddered, "the police said it looked like a robbery, but nothing was taken except this manuscript. Fortunately, I had photographed it earlier. And the attempt on you. Last night, someone broke into my apartment. I heard them searching my study and managed to slip out through the bedroom window. I spent the night in a hotel and came here first thing this morning. Just then, the elevator groaned to life upstairs, Wolfe's morning descent from the plant rooms. I heard his footsteps in the hall. Then he appeared in the doorway, all 285 pounds of him, carrying a small purple orchid in a pot. Archie." He nodded at me, then noticed our visitor. His eyebrows went up a fraction of an inch, which for Wolfe constituted wild surprise. "Dr. Margaret Ashford," I said. "She has a problem involving murder and medieval treasure." Wolfe's scowl deepened. He moved to his desk, settled his bulk into the custom-made chair, and placed the orchid carefully on his desk blotter. "Dr. Ashford," he said, without looking at her, "I do not investigate treasure hunts, medieval or otherwise. Mr. Goodwin will see you out." "Mr. Wolfe," she said quickly, "someone killed Hendrik van der Berg for this manuscript, and they tried to kill me. The police think it was a simple robbery, but I know better. This document contains information about a treasure worth millions, and someone is willing to commit murder to get it. Then take it to the police." I did. They weren't interested in medieval manuscripts and ancient treasures. They told me to get better locks. Wolfe picked up his orchid and examined it with the kind of attention most people reserve for their firstborn children. "The police are occasionally correct," he murmured. Dr. Ashford stood up abruptly, her face flushing. "I can pay you handsomely, Mr. Wolfe. The university has authorized me to offer you $10,000 to find Professor van der Berg's killer and recover the original manuscript." That got Wolfe's attention. His eyes flicked to her face, then to the parchment she was still holding. 10,000, he repeated. Plus expenses. Wolfe was quiet for a long moment, studying the orchid. Finally, he sighed the sigh of a man about to do something he'd regret. Very well, show me this manuscript. As Dr. Ashford unrolled the parchment on his desk, I heard a familiar scratching at the office door. I opened it to find Diana, the largest of our 5 Dobermans, standing in the hallway with her ears pricked forward. Behind her, the other 4, Minerva, Apollo, Caesar, and Mars, were arranged like a canine welcoming committee. The dogs had been with us for 6 months now, a legacy from our last case involving a murdered dog breeder. Wolfe had grumbled about the expense and inconvenience, but I noticed he never seriously considered getting rid of them. They'd proven their worth several times over, and their presence had turned the brownstone into something approaching an impregnable fortress. Diana padded into the office and stationed herself near Dr. Ashford's chair, her dark eyes fixed on our visitor. The other dogs remained in the hallway, alert but relaxed. They sensed tension, I explained to Dr. Ashford, who was eyeing Diana nervously. Don't worry, she won't bite unless someone threatens us. Wolfe was studying the manuscript with a magnifying glass. His lips pursed. This appears genuine, he admitted. The script is consistent with 13th-century Leonese, and the parchment shows appropriate aging. Hendrik thought so too, Dr. Ashford said. But it's what he decoded that got him killed. And what was that? He said the treasure wasn't just gold and jewels. According to the manuscript, the monks of San Marcos were the guardians of something called the Corona Mortis, the crown of death. Hendrik believed it referred to a lost relic of enormous historical importance. Wolfe set down his magnifying glass. Dr. Ashford, I am a detective, not an archaeologist. What precisely do you want me to find? Professor Van Der Berg's killer, and the original manuscript. It contains additional pages that might reveal the location of the treasure. And you believe this treasure actually exists? I believe someone else believes it exists, she replied. And that's enough to make them kill. Wolfe nodded slowly. A reasonable distinction. Archie, we have work to do. After Dr. Ashford left, taking her photographs of the manuscript, but leaving us with detailed copies, I spent the rest of the morning on the phone digging into the background of the late Professor Hendrik van der Berg. What I found was interesting enough to warrant a trip to the scene of the crime. Van der Berg's apartment was on the Upper West Side, a 4th-floor walk-up in one of those pre-war buildings that looked distinguished from the outside and cramped from within. The police had finished with it, but the building superintendent, a grizzled character named Murphy, who was impressed by my badge and a $20 bill, let me take a look around. The apartment had been thoroughly tossed. Books were scattered across the floor, desk drawers pulled out and emptied, file cabinets ransacked. But whoever had done this had been methodical, not the frenzied destruction you'd expect from a junkie looking for something to pawn, but the careful search of someone who knew exactly what they were after. Shame about the professor, Murphy said, leaning against the doorframe. Nice quiet fella, always paid his rent on time. Terrible thing getting killed for a few dollars. The police think it was robbery? That's what they said. Though it's funny, his wallet was still in his jacket pocket, watch still on his wrist. What kind of thief leaves that behind? I spent another 20 minutes looking around, but the killer had been thorough. If there had been any clues, they were long gone. As I was leaving, Murphy mentioned something that made me pause. Funny thing though, day before he died, the professor had visitors, 3 of them all together. Don't usually see that many people coming to see him at once. What did they look like? One was a big fella, real distinguished looking with white hair and an expensive suit. The other was younger, maybe 40, foreign accent. And there was a woman with dark hair, real elegant. They stayed about an hour. I thanked Murphy and headed back to the brownstone, my mind working over this new information. 3 visitors the day before Van der Berg was killed. That was worth following up on. I found Wolfe in his chair, reading what appeared to be a scholarly article about medieval monasteries. Diana was lying on the rug beside his desk, and I could hear the other 4 dogs somewhere in the house, probably in the kitchen, pestering Fritz for scraps. Any luck? Wolfe asked without looking up. Some. Van der Berg had 3 visitors the day before he died. 2 men and a woman, all well dressed. The super said they stayed about an hour. What else? The apartment was searched very thoroughly, but the killer left Van der Berg's wallet and watch. This wasn't a robbery gone wrong. Someone was looking for something specific. The manuscript. That's my guess, but there's something else. I made some calls about Van der Berg's professional life. Turns out he had a reputation for being, let's say, flexible about the provenance of certain artifacts. Wolfe's eyebrows rose slightly. A trafficker in stolen antiquities? Not exactly stolen, but maybe not entirely legitimate. He'd made some enemies in academic circles, people who questioned his methods. There's a Professor Harold Whitmore at NYU who's been very vocal about Van der Berg's questionable scholarship. Jealousy is a common motive for murder, Wolfe observed. There's more. Van der Berg had been working with a dealer named Marcus Kellerman, who specializes in medieval manuscripts and religious artifacts. Kellerman has a gallery in the village and a reputation for asking very few questions about where his merchandise comes from. Wolfe set aside his reading. We'll need to speak with both of them. Also, I want you to contact Saul and have him look into Dr. Ashford's background. $10,000 is a substantial fee for recovering a manuscript, regardless of its historical value. I was about to reply when the doorbell rang. Through the office window, I could see a black sedan parked at the curb, the kind favored by federal agents and funeral directors. Expecting someone? I asked. Wolfe shook his head, looking annoyed. I went to answer the door, with Diana padding along beside me. The other dogs materialized from various parts of the house, forming a loose semicircle in the hallway. Standing on the stoop was Inspector Kramer of Manhattan Homicide, looking as grumpy as ever, flanked by 2 men in expensive suits who had federal agent written all over them. Goodwin, Kramer growled. We need to talk to Wolfe. About what? About the Van der Berg murder, and about why you were poking around the crime scene this morning. I led them into the office, where Wolfe greeted Kramer with his usual enthusiasm, which is to say, none at all. Inspector, Wolfe said without rising from his chair. To what do I owe this interruption? Cut the crap, Wolfe. I know Dr. Ashford hired you to investigate Van der Berg's murder. What I want to know is what you've stirred up. One of the federal agents stepped forward. He was tall and thin, with prematurely grey hair and the kind of pale complexion that suggested he spent most of his time in windowless offices. Mr. Wolfe, he said, I'm Special Agent Morrison, FBI. This is Agent Kowalski. We understand you're investigating the death of Professor Van der Berg. I am investigating several matters, Wolfe replied carefully. The death of Professor Van der Berg may be among them. Then you need to stop, Morrison said flatly. This case involves national security issues that are beyond your purview. Wolfe's expression didn't change, but I could see his jaw tighten slightly. Diana, still lying beside his desk, raised her head and fixed the federal agents with a steady stare. Agent Morrison, Wolfe said, unless you are prepared to arrest me, I suggest you explain your concerns in a more civilized manner. Morrison glanced at his partner, then at Kramer, who was looking increasingly uncomfortable. The manuscript Professor Van der Berg was killed for, Morrison said finally, may contain information related to an ongoing federal investigation. We can't go into details, but I can tell you that several foreign intelligence services have shown interest in medieval artifacts recently. Foreign intelligence services? I said. You mean spies are interested in 13th-century monk treasure? I mean, Morrison said coldly, that you're out of your depth, Goodwin. There are forces at work here that you couldn't possibly understand. That was when Caesar, the second largest of our Dobermans, chose to wander into the office. He took one look at the federal agents and let out a low growl that seemed to start somewhere around his toenails. Gentlemen, Wolfe said mildly, I believe you've overstayed your welcome. Kramer sighed heavily. Look, Wolfe, I don't know what kind of hornet's nest you've kicked over, but these boys are serious. Maybe you should consider dropping this case. Inspector Wolfe replied, I have been retained to find a murderer. Unless you can prove that Professor Van der Berg was killed by foreign agents in pursuit of national secrets, I intend to fulfill my obligation to my client. Morrison started to say something, but Kowalski put a hand on his arm. They exchanged glances, then Morrison pulled out a business card and placed it on Wolfe's desk. "If you learn anything at all, about that manuscript or what Van der Berg discovered, you call me immediately. Is that understood?" Wolfe picked up the card and examined it as if it were a particularly uninteresting insect. "I understand your request, Agent Morrison. Whether I comply with it remains to be seen." After they left, I made sure the front door was securely locked and activated the alarm system. The 5 dogs had dispersed throughout the house, but I knew they'd be alert for any unusual sounds or movements. "Well," I said, settling back behind my desk, "that was interesting. Federal agents, foreign spies, and ancient treasures. You sure know how to pick your cases." "I didn't pick this case, Archie. It picked me." Wolfe was studying Morrison's business card with a frown. "But the involvement of federal agents does add a certain complexity to the matter. You think there's really something to this spy angle?" "I think," Wolfe said slowly, "that we need to learn a great deal more about the treasure of the dead monks before we can determine what Professor Van der Berg discovered that was worth killing him for." The next morning I paid a visit to Marcus Kellerman's gallery in Greenwich Village. It was one of those narrow, cluttered shops that look like they haven't been cleaned since the Hoover administration, with manuscripts and artifacts crammed onto every available surface. The air smelled of old parchment, incense, and something else I couldn't quite identify, something musty and faintly unpleasant. Kellerman himself was a small, nervous man in his 60s, with the kind of pale, indoor complexion that suggested he rarely ventured far from his books. He was hunched over a desk in the back of the shop, examining what looked like an illuminated prayer book through a jeweler's loupe. "Mr. Kellerman," I said, showing him my license. "I'm investigating the death of Professor Van der Berg." His head snapped up, and I saw fear flicker across his features before he managed to compose himself. "Terrible business," he said, setting down the loupe with hands that weren't quite steady. "Hendrik was a valued colleague. I understand it was a robbery. That's what the police think. But you and I both know it wasn't, don't we?" Kellerman's Adam's apple bobbed as he swallowed hard. "I'm sure I don't know what you mean." I pulled out one of the photographs Dr. Ashford had left with us, a clear shot of the manuscript's opening page. Kellerman's eyes widened when he saw it. "Where did you get that?" "From someone who's still alive, which puts her one up on Professor Van der Berg. You recognize it? It appears to be a genuine medieval manuscript, 13th century, possibly Spanish in origin. Come on, Kellerman. Van der Berg brought this to you 3 days before he died. What did he want you to do with it?" For a moment I thought he was going to deny it, but then his shoulders sagged in defeat. "He wanted me to authenticate it," he admitted, "and to help him find a buyer." "A buyer? You mean he was planning to sell it?" Hendrik was always short of money. The university doesn't pay its professors very much, and he had expensive tastes. He occasionally brought me items of questionable provenance. "Stolen goods, you mean?" "Not stolen, exactly. More like items that had found their way onto the market through unofficial channels. Estate sales where the heirs didn't know what they had, that sort of thing. And this manuscript." Kellerman hesitated, then pulled out a file folder from his desk drawer. Hendrik claimed it was part of a collection acquired from a private estate in Spain. The family had owned it for generations, supposedly, but needed money and were willing to sell quietly to avoid taxes. Did you believe him? I had my doubts. The manuscript was too important, too valuable to be sitting in someone's private collection, unknown to scholars. But the work appeared genuine, and Hendrik was very excited about it. Excited how? He said it contained clues to the location of a medieval treasure, something called the Corona Mortis, the crown of death. He claimed it was worth millions. I leaned back in my chair. "And you believe that?" "I believe Hendrik believed it. He'd been researching the legend for years, ever since he first heard about it from a colleague in Spain. The story goes that the monks of San Marcos were entrusted with guarding a sacred relic, something so valuable that when the monastery was threatened, they hid it rather than let it fall into enemy hands." "What kind of relic?" "No one knows for sure. Some say it was a crown worn by Christ. others that it was a collection of relics from the apostles. The legend has persisted for centuries, attracting treasure hunters and archaeologists alike, but no one has ever found any real evidence that it existed. Until now, Hendrik thought so. He said the manuscript contained specific directions to the treasure's hiding place. I studied Kellerman's nervous face. So who else knew about this, besides you and Van der Berg? I may have mentioned it to a few colleagues, he admitted reluctantly. What colleagues? Well, there's Professor Whitmore at NYU. He and Hendrik had been rivals for years, competing over the same research areas, and I spoke with Lady Catherine Morrison. She's a collector, very wealthy, very interested in medieval artifacts. Lady Catherine Morrison, any relation to the FBI agent who paid us a visit yesterday? Kellerman blinked in confusion. FBI agent? I wouldn't know. Lady Morrison is English, lives here part of the year. She has a magnificent collection of medieval art and manuscripts. I made a note to check on that connection. Anyone else? There was a man who came in, asking about medieval Spanish manuscripts, just a few days before Hendrik brought me the document. Foreign fellow, spoke with an accent, said he represented a private collector who was interested in acquiring rare items. Did he give you a name? He called himself Senor Valdez, left a card, but when I tried to call the number later, it was disconnected. I took down what details Kellerman could remember about this Senor Valdez, then headed uptown to NYU to have a chat with Professor Harold Whitmore. The contrast between Whitmore and Kellerman couldn't have been more stark. Where Kellerman was nervous and apologetic, Whitmore was arrogant and condescending, the sort of academic who treated anyone without a PhD like a slow-witted child. His office was in the Medieval Studies building, a cramped space lined floor to ceiling with books and academic journals. Whitmore himself was a big man with wild grey hair and the kind of tweedy professorial appearance that looked like it came straight from central casting. Professor Van Der Berg, he said when I mentioned the name, was a charlatan and a fraud. His death was unfortunate, but hardly surprising given the disreputable circles he moved in. Strong words, I said. Care to elaborate? Hendrik had no respect for proper scholarly methodology. He was always chasing after sensational discoveries, trying to make his name with dramatic finds rather than solid research. The treasure of the dead monks was typical of his approach. Medieval fantasy masquerading as serious scholarship. So you don't believe the treasure exists? The Corona Mortis is a legend, Mr. Goodwin. Nothing more. Medieval chronicles are full of such stories. Hidden treasures, sacred relics, mysterious artifacts. Scholars study them as examples of medieval folklore, not as treasure maps. But Van der Berg thought differently. Van der Berg was a fool. Whitmore's face was flushed with anger. He came to me 3 days before his death, claiming he'd found definitive proof of the Corona Mortis. He wanted me to join him in some ridiculous expedition to locate the treasure. And you refused? Of course I refused. I'm a serious scholar, not a treasure hunter. I told him he was making a laughingstock of himself and the entire department. That must have made him angry. Hendrik was always angry about something. He couldn't accept that his theories were based on wishful thinking rather than facts. I studied Whitmore's face. There was something more here, some deeper animosity between the two men that went beyond academic disagreement. Where were you Tuesday night, Professor? His face went pale. Are you suggesting that I had something to do with Hendrik's death? I'm asking where you were. I was home, grading papers. My wife can verify that. I took down his address and left him sputtering with indignation. Outside, I called the brownstone to check in with Wolfe. Any progress? He asked. Some. Kellerman admits Van der Berg brought him the manuscript for authentication and to find a buyer, and there was a mysterious foreign gentleman asking about Spanish manuscripts just before Van der Berg showed up. Interesting. What about Professor Whitmore? Claims Van der Berg was a fool, chasing fantasies. Says he was home grading papers Tuesday night. I'll have Saul check his alibi. Do that. Also, I've been researching the legend of the Corona Mortis. It's more substantial than I initially believed. How so? There are multiple historical references to the treasure, dating back to the 13th century. Whatever the monks of San Marcos were guarding, it was valuable enough to attract the attention of kings and popes. Several expeditions were mounted over the centuries to find it. Any of them successful? None that left records, but the legend persisted, which suggests there may be some basis in fact. I was about to reply when I noticed a black sedan pulling away from the curb across the street, the same make and model as the car Agent Morrison had arrived in yesterday. I couldn't see the license plate clearly, but it looked like we were being watched. "Wolfe," I said, "I think our federal friends are keeping tabs on us." "Not unexpected. Come home, Archie. We have work to do." That evening, Saul Panzer called with his report on Dr. Ashford's background. As always, Saul had been thorough, too thorough for my taste, since it meant Dr. Ashford had been lying to us. "She's not exactly what she claims," Saul said. "Margaret Ashford does teach at Columbia, but she's not just a medieval scholar. She's also a consultant for several auction houses and private collectors, specializing in the authentication and acquisition of rare manuscripts." Wolfe was listening on the extension in his office, while I took the call at my desk. The 5 Dobermans were scattered around the room. Diana at Wolfe's feet, Caesar by the door, and the other 3 arranged in strategic positions that would allow them to intercept any threat quickly. "How much money are we talking about?" I asked. "Substantial. She's brokered deals worth millions over the past few years. And here's the interesting part. 3 months ago, she was retained by a Lady Catherine Morrison to locate and acquire a specific medieval manuscript." Wolfe and I exchanged glances. That was the same Lady Catherine Morrison that Kellerman had mentioned. "Any details on what manuscript?" Wolfe asked. "Not specific ones, but the contract mentions medieval Spanish religious documents, particularly those related to the monastery of San Marcos. So Dr. Ashford hadn't come to us as a concerned academic whose colleague had been murdered. She'd come as a dealer who'd lost a valuable piece of merchandise and wanted us to get it back for her. That put a different spin on the whole case." "Anything else?" I asked. "Professor Whitmore's alibi checks out. His wife confirms he was home Tuesday night, but I did find something interesting about our foreign friend, the one calling himself Senor Valdez." "What's that?" I showed his description around some of the antique shops in the village. "Turns out he's been making inquiries about Spanish medieval artifacts for several weeks, always paying cash, always using false names. One dealer remembers him asking specifically about monastery documents. Any idea who he really is?" "Working on it. But here's what's interesting. Lady Catherine Morrison has been seen in his company. They were spotted together at an auction house in Midtown just last week." After Saul hung up, Wolfe sat in silence for several minutes, his fingers drumming on his desk blotter. Finally, he looked up at me. "We need to speak with Lady Catherine Morrison," he said. "And we need to confront Dr. Ashford about her deception." "Which first?" "Dr. Ashford. If she's been lying to us about her motives, there may be other deceptions as well." I called Dr. Ashford at her hotel and asked her to come to the brownstone immediately. She arrived within an hour, looking nervous and tired. When I ushered her into the office, she seemed to sense the change in atmosphere. "Is something wrong?" she asked, settling into the red leather chair. "Dr. Ashford," Wolfe said without preamble, "you have not been entirely truthful with us." Her face went pale. "I don't know what you mean." "You are not merely a concerned colleague, seeking justice for Professor Van Der Berg. You are a dealer in medieval manuscripts, and you were working with Lady Catherine Morrison to acquire the very document that got Van Der Berg killed." For a moment she said nothing, her hands clenched in her lap. Then she sighed deeply and seemed to deflate. "All right," she said quietly. "Yes, I was hired by Lady Catherine to find manuscripts related to the monastery of San Marcos, but that doesn't change the fact that Hendrik was murdered." "It changes your motives considerably," Wolfe replied. "Were you planning to acquire the manuscript legitimately, or were you prepared to use other methods?" "I'm not a thief, Mr. Wolfe. I work within the law mostly, but medieval manuscripts are often held by people who don't understand their true value. Sometimes it's possible to acquire them through creative negotiations. And if Professor Van Der Berg had refused to sell, I would have found another way. But I didn't kill him, if that's what you're implying. I leaned forward. Tell us about Lady Catherine Morrison. She's a collector, extremely wealthy, with a particular interest in medieval religious artifacts. She's been searching for documents related to the Corona Mortis for years. Why? Dr. Ashford hesitated. She believes the treasure is real. More than that, she believes she knows where it is. Wolfe's eyebrows went up. Explain. Lady Catherine's family has a connection to the story. Her ancestor, Sir Edmund Morrison, was a crusader who supposedly fought alongside the knights who originally brought the Corona Mortis to San Marcos. According to family legend, he was given a map showing the treasure's location. And this map, lost centuries ago. But Lady Catherine believes that the monastery's records, documents like the one Van Der Berg found, might contain clues that would allow her to reconstruct it. Where is Lady Catherine now? I asked. She has a suite at the plaza. But Mr. Goodwin, you have to understand, she's not a killer. She's a refined English lady who happens to have an obsession with medieval history. Refined people can be quite capable of murder, Wolfe observed, particularly when large sums of money are involved. After Dr. Ashford left, with stern warnings about any further deceptions, Wolfe asked me to arrange a meeting with Lady Catherine Morrison for the following morning. Then he went up to his room to read, leaving me to make the phone calls and coordinate with Saul for additional surveillance. It was nearly midnight when the alarm system went off. I was in my room, getting ready for bed, when the shrill beeping started. Immediately, I could hear the dogs responding, 5 sets of claws clicking on hardwood floors as they moved into defensive positions throughout the house. By the time I got downstairs with my gun, Diana was at the front door growling deep in her throat, while Caesar and Mars had positioned themselves at the back entrance. The alarm panel showed a breach in the rear garden. Someone had climbed over the fence and was moving toward the house. I killed the lights and peered out through the kitchen window. In the dim glow from the street lamps, I could see a dark figure crouched near the basement entrance, working on the lock with some kind of tool. I was about to call the police when Wolfe appeared beside me, surprisingly quiet for a man of his size. "One intruder," I whispered, trying to get in through the basement. "The dogs?" "Minerva and Apollo are covering the basement stairs from inside. The others are positioned at the main entrances." Wolfe nodded approvingly. Whatever else you could say about the Dobermans, they'd turned our home into something approaching a fortress. Any intruder who made it inside would find himself facing 5 highly trained guard dogs, not to mention an armed private detective. As we watched, the figure at the basement door suddenly froze, then began backing away from the house. A moment later, he was over the fence and gone. I heard a car engine start up in the alley behind us. "Scared off by the dogs," I said. "Or by something else," Wolfe replied thoughtfully. "This was reconnaissance, Archie, not a serious attempt at burglary. Someone wanted to see how well defended we are. Think it was our friend Senor Valdez? Possibly. Or one of Agent Morrison's people, keeping tabs on us. In either case, we should be prepared for additional attention." I spent the next hour checking all the locks and alarms, then posted the dogs in a defensive pattern throughout the house. Whatever was going on with the treasure of the dead monks, it was clear that we'd stirred up more than just academic interest. As I finally headed back to bed, I found myself wondering what Professor Van Der Berg had discovered that was worth killing for, and more importantly, whether we were going to live long enough to find out. Lady Catherine Morrison turned out to be everything Dr. Ashford had promised: refined, elegant, and completely obsessed with medieval history. She arrived at the brownstone Friday morning in a chauffeured Bentley, dressed in an expensive suit that probably cost more than I made in 6 months. She was younger than I'd expected, maybe 45, with the kind of aristocratic features that suggested generations of careful breeding. Her dark hair was perfectly styled, her makeup flawless, and she carried herself with the quiet confidence that comes from never having to worry about money. But it was her eyes that caught my attention, pale blue and intensely focused, with the kind of zealous gleam I'd seen before in collectors and fanatics. This was a woman who was used to getting what she wanted, and I suspected she wasn't particularly concerned about the methods required to get it. "Mr. Wolfe," she said, settling gracefully into the red leather chair, I understand you're investigating poor Professor van der Berg's death. Among other things, Wolfe replied. He was studying her with the same intensity she was focusing on him, like two chess players evaluating each other's opening moves. A terrible loss, Lady Catherine continued. Hendrik was a brilliant scholar, one of the few people who understood the true significance of the Corona Mortis. And what significance is that? The treasure of the dead monks isn't just gold and jewels, Mr. Wolfe. It's one of the most important religious artifacts in Christian history. Explain. Lady Catherine opened her purse and pulled out a leather folder. From it, she extracted what appeared to be a photograph of an ancient map. This is a copy of a document from my family's archives, she said, placing it on Wolfe's desk. It was drawn by my ancestor, Sir Edmund Morrison, in the 13th century. The map showed what looked like the floor plan of a medieval monastery, with various chambers and passages marked in faded ink. There were symbols scattered throughout, crosses, circles, and what appeared to be Latin inscriptions. Sir Edmund was present when the Corona Mortis was brought to San Marcos, Lady Catherine continued. According to his journal, it wasn't just any religious relic. It was the actual crown of thorns placed on Christ's head during the crucifixion. Wolfe's expression didn't change, but I could see he was skeptical. A remarkable claim. Do you have evidence to support it? The crown was authenticated by Pope Innocent IV himself in 1247. It was considered so sacred that it couldn't be displayed publicly. Too dangerous, given the political situation in Spain at the time. So it was entrusted to the monks of San Marcos for safekeeping. And when the monastery was attacked, the monks hid the crown rather than let it fall into the hands of raiders. Sir Edmund's map shows the general layout of the monastery, but not the specific location where the treasure was concealed. That information was contained in the monastery's own records. I leaned forward to study the map. Records like the manuscript Professor van der Berg found. Exactly. Hendrik believed he'd discovered the key to interpreting the monk's hiding place. He was going to share his findings with me, but she shrugged elegantly. But someone killed him first, I finished. Indeed, which is why I'm prepared to pay handsomely for your services, Mr. Wolfe. I want you to find both the murderer and the manuscript. Dr. Ashford has already retained me for that purpose. Lady Catherine's smile was razor-sharp. Margaret is working for me, Mr. Wolfe, has been for months. Whatever fee she offered you, I'm prepared to double it. Wolfe was quiet for a long moment, his fingers drumming on the desk. Diana, who had been lying quietly beside his chair, suddenly raised her head and looked toward the window. A moment later, Caesar appeared in the doorway, ears pricked forward in alert attention. Expecting someone else? I asked Lady Catherine. Not that I'm aware of. I went to the window and peered out through the curtains. A man was standing across the street, partially concealed behind a parked car. Even at a distance, I could see he was watching our building. Friend of yours? I asked, pointing him out to Lady Catherine. She glanced out the window, and I saw her face tighten slightly. I've never seen him before, but something in her tone suggested otherwise. I made a mental note to have Saul check on this mysterious watcher. Lady Catherine, Wolfe said, where were you Tuesday evening when Professor van der Berg was killed? At the Metropolitan Opera, La Bohème. I have the ticket stubs if you require proof. And your associate, the gentleman calling himself Senor Valdez? This time, her composure slipped completely. For just a moment, real fear flashed across her features. I don't know anyone by that name, she said, but her voice lacked conviction. Lady Catherine, Wolfe said gently, I have already established that you and this gentleman have been seen together. Lying to me will not advance your cause. She was quiet for a long moment, staring down at her hands. When she looked up again, the aristocratic mask was back in place, but I could see the worry in her eyes. His real name is Eduardo Vega, she admitted. He's a Spanish antiquarian who's been helping me research the Corona Mortis. He has connections in Spain that have been useful. What sort of connections? Contacts in monasteries, private collections, government archives, the kind of people who might know about documents that haven't made their way into official channels. You mean stolen artifacts? I said. I mean artifacts that have been in private hands for so long that their ownership is complicated. Eduardo helps me navigate those complications. Wolfe nodded slowly. And where is Senor Vega now? I don't know. He was supposed to meet with me yesterday, but he never appeared. I've been trying to reach him, but his phone goes straight to voicemail. When did you last see him? 3 days ago. He said he had a lead on the manuscript. Professor Van Der Berg had found. He wanted to approach Van Der Berg directly, but I told him to wait. I thought it would be better to work through Margaret. But he didn't wait. Apparently not. After Lady Catherine left, promising to call if she heard from Eduardo Vega, I did a more thorough check of the street. The man who'd been watching our building was gone, but I had the distinct feeling we were still under surveillance.
What do you think?
I asked Wolfe when I returned to the office. I think Lady Catherine knows more about Senor Vega's activities than she's admitting, and I think Professor Van Der Berg's murder is more complicated than a simple robbery gone wrong. You think Vega killed him? It's possible, or Vega may have been working with someone else, someone who decided Van Der Berg was more valuable dead than alive. The phone rang, interrupting our speculation. It was Dr. Ashford, and she sounded frightened. Mr. Wolfe, she said, I think someone's been following me. And there's something else. I remembered something about the manuscript that might be important. What is it? There was a section I didn't photograph completely. Something about a guardian who watches over the treasure. Hendrik was very excited about it. Said it might be the key to everything. Can you come to the office? I'm not sure that's safe. Could Mr. Goodwin meet me somewhere public? The reading room at the main library, perhaps. I looked at Wolfe, who nodded. I'll be there in an hour, I told her. As I was getting ready to leave, Wolfe called me back to his desk. Take Caesar with you, he said. And be very careful, Archie. I suspect we're approaching the heart of this mystery, and that makes us dangerous to someone. I clipped a leash to Caesar's collar and headed for the door, wondering what new complications Dr. Ashford was about to add to an already tangled case. Outside, the October air was crisp and clear, but I couldn't shake the feeling that somewhere in the shadows, someone was watching and waiting. The main branch of the New York Public Library was busy for a Friday afternoon, filled with students, researchers, and the usual collection of characters who treat the reading room as a warm place to spend the day. I found Dr. Ashford at a table in the far corner, surrounded by stacks of books on medieval history. Caesar had attracted some attention as we made our way through the library. Dobermans aren't exactly common in reading rooms, but I'd flashed my license and mentioned police business, which seemed to satisfy the security guards. Dr. Ashford looked haggard, as if she hadn't slept much since our last conversation. She kept glancing around nervously, and I noticed her hands were shaking slightly as she turned the pages of a massive tome on Spanish monasteries. Thanks for coming, she said quietly. I didn't want to go back to the brownstone until I was sure I wasn't being followed.
Are you?
I think so. There's been a man watching my hotel since yesterday, different from the one who broke into my apartment, but definitely surveillance. I settled into a chair across from her, with Caesar lying down beside me in a position where he could watch the approaches to our table. Tell me about this guardian, I said. Dr. Ashford pulled out a manila folder and extracted several photographs. These are the pictures I took of the manuscript pages I didn't show you before. Look at this section. She pointed to a portion of text in the medieval Latin, with symbols drawn in the margins that looked like a combination of religious imagery and crude maps. Hendrik translated this passage for me, she continued. It refers to something called the Custos Mortises, the guardian of death. According to the text, the Corona Mortis wasn't just hidden when the monastery was attacked. It was placed under the protection of a guardian, someone whose job was to ensure that only the worthy could find it. What kind of guardian? That's where it gets interesting. The manuscript suggests that the guardian wasn't just a person, it was a bloodline, a family charged with protecting the secret of the treasure's location, generation after generation. I studied the photographs. The symbols were clearer than in the images Dr. Ashford had shown us earlier, and I could make out what appeared to be a coat of arms or family crest. Any idea whose family? Hendrik thought he knew. He'd been researching Spanish noble families connected to the monastery, and he believed he'd identified the guardian bloodline. And the family name was Vega. That got my attention. As in Eduardo Vega, Lady Catherine's Spanish associate.
Exactly.
Hendrik thought Eduardo might be a direct descendant of the original guardian family. I leaned back in my chair, thinking, if Eduardo Vega was descended from the guardians of the Corona Mortis, that would explain his interest in the manuscript. It might also explain why he'd disappeared, and why Professor Van Der Berg had been murdered. There's more, Dr. Ashford continued. According to the manuscript, the guardian family was given specific instructions about how to verify the identity of anyone seeking the treasure. There were tests, challenges that had to be met before the location would be revealed. What kind of tests? I don't know. Hendrik was working on that translation when he was killed, but he did say something about the guardian having the power to determine who was worthy of the Corona Mortis. I was about to ask another question when Caesar suddenly raised his head. His ears pricked forward in alert attention. A moment later, I saw what had caught his notice. A man in a dark coat walking purposefully toward our table. It was Eduardo Vega, and he didn't look like he was in a friendly mood. "Dr. Ashford," he said in accented English, stopping about 6 feet away from our table. "You have something that belongs to my family." I stood up, keeping one hand on Caesar's leash. The Doberman was on his feet as well, not growling but clearly ready for action. "Mr. Vega, I assume," I said. "I'm Archie Goodwin. We've been looking for you." "I'm sure you have." His dark eyes flicked from me to Dr. Ashford, then to the photograph spread on the table. "Those documents contain information that has been guarded by my family for 7 centuries. You have no right to them." "Actually," I replied, "those documents were stolen from a murdered professor. That makes them evidence in a homicide investigation." "Professor Van Der Berg was a thief," Vega said coldly. "He stole the manuscript from its rightful owner." "And who would that be?" "The descendants of the monks who created it. The guardians who have protected its secrets for generations." Dr. Ashford had gone pale, but she managed to speak up. "Eduardo, you don't understand. Lady Catherine hired me to find these documents legitimately. We weren't trying to steal anything." "Lady Catherine Morrison is a fool," Vega replied. "She thinks money can buy her access to sacred mysteries, but some secrets cannot be purchased." I glanced around the reading room. Other patrons were beginning to notice our conversation, and I could see a security guard heading in our direction. This wasn't the place for a confrontation. "Mr. Vega," I said quietly, "if you want to discuss this, let's do it somewhere more private. I'm sure we can work something out." He studied my face for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "Very well, but understand this, Mr. Goodwin. The Corona Mortis belongs to those who have sworn to protect it. Anyone who tries to steal it will face the consequences." "Is that a threat?" "It's a promise." He turned and walked away, leaving us with more questions than answers. Dr. Ashford was gathering up her photographs with trembling hands. "What do we do now?" she asked. "Now we go back to the brownstone and figure out what Eduardo Vega isn't telling us," I replied. "But first I want to make sure we're not being followed." I led Dr. Ashford out of the library through a side exit, with Caesar scouting ahead of us. We took a circuitous route back to West 35th Street, doubling back several times to check for surveillance. By the time we reached the brownstone, I was reasonably confident we'd lost anyone who might have been tailing us. But as we approached the front door, Caesar suddenly stopped and growled low in his throat. Looking up at the brownstone, I could see that something was wrong. One of the upstairs windows was open, and I was sure it had been closed when I left. "Stay behind me," I told Dr. Ashford, drawing my gun as we climbed the steps to the front door. The front door was still locked, but as soon as I opened it, I could hear the other 4 Dobermans moving through the house in an agitated pattern that meant they'd detected an intruder. Diana appeared at the top of the stairs, hackles raised, while Minerva and Apollo flanked the entrance to the office. "Fritz?" I called out. "In the kitchen," Archie, came his voice. "But someone was here. They left something for Mr. Wolfe." I found Wolfe in his office, studying a manila envelope that had been placed on his desk. He looked up when I entered with Dr. Ashford and Caesar. "Our visitor was quite considerate," he said dryly. He left his message without disturbing anything else. How did he get in? Through the basement window. Fritz found it open when he went down to check the wine cellar. Whoever it was knew exactly where to go and what to do. He disabled the alarm system, avoided the dogs, and left this envelope on my desk without touching anything else. I opened the envelope carefully. Inside was a single sheet of paper with a message written in the same medieval script as the manuscript Dr. Ashford had shown us. There was also a small object wrapped in tissue paper. "Can you read it?" I asked Dr. Ashford. She studied the Latin text for a moment. "It's a warning," she said finally. "It says something like, 'The guardian watches. The unworthy will be punished. Those who seek the Corona Mortis without permission will find only death.'" "Cheerful," I muttered, unwrapping the tissue paper. Inside was a small silver medallion, tarnished with age, bearing the same coat of arms we'd seen in the manuscript photographs. Wolfe examined the medallion with his magnifying glass. 13th-century Spanish workmanship, he observed, probably from the original monastery. "So Eduardo Vega has been here," Dr. Ashford said. "Not necessarily," Wolfe replied. "This medallion could have been placed here by anyone with access to artifacts from San Marcos. It's meant to authenticate the warning, to prove that whoever sent it has legitimate claim to guardianship of the treasure. But you don't buy it. I think," Wolfe said slowly, "that we're dealing with someone who wants us to believe they're the rightful guardian of the Corona Mortis. Whether that's actually true remains to be seen." The phone rang, interrupting our discussion. It was Saul Panzer, calling with more background on Eduardo Vega. "Interesting character," Saul reported. "Real name Eduardo Vega Mendoza, age 42, born in Madrid. He's got a legitimate business as an antiquarian, specializing in medieval Spanish artifacts. But he's also suspected by Interpol of trafficking in stolen religious items." "Any connection to the monastery of San Marcos?" I asked. "That's where it gets complicated. Vega claims his family has been associated with the monastery for centuries, and there's some documentation to support that. But Spanish church records from that period are incomplete, so it's hard to verify." "What about his current activities?" "He's been in New York for about 6 months, working with several collectors and auction houses. He's got a temporary visa and is staying at a small hotel in the village. But here's the interesting part. 3 days ago, he bought a one-way ticket to Madrid, departing tomorrow morning." Wolfe and I exchanged glances. If Vega was planning to leave the country, it suggested he'd either found what he was looking for or decided the risks were too great to continue.
Anything else?
Wolfe asked. "One more thing. I did some digging on Lady Catherine Morrison's background. Turns out she's not quite as wealthy as she appears. Her family fortune was mostly lost in the 1930s, and she's been living off credit and loans for years. If she could find a treasure worth millions, she'd be desperate enough to kill for it," I finished. After Saul hung up, we sat in silence for a few minutes, contemplating the tangle of motives and suspects we'd uncovered. Dr. Ashford was studying the photographs from the manuscript, occasionally making notes on a legal pad. "Mr. Wolfe," she said finally, "I think I know why Hendrik was killed." "Explain." "Look at this section of the manuscript." She pointed to a passage near the bottom of one of the pages. It's not just instructions for finding the treasure, it's a genealogical record. I leaned over to look at the text. Even without being able to read Latin, I could see what appeared to be family names and dates. "It's a list of the guardian families," Dr. Ashford continued. "The bloodlines entrusted with protecting the Corona Mortis, and according to this, there were originally 3 families involved, not just one. 3 guardians. Each family was given part of the information needed to locate the treasure. No single family could find it alone. They would have to work together. And the families were Vega, as we suspected, but also Kellerman and Morrison. That hit like a cold slap. Kellerman, as in Marcus Kellerman, the manuscript dealer, and Morrison, as in Lady Catherine Morrison. So our 3 main suspects are all descended from the original guardians of the treasure," I said. "That's either a hell of a coincidence or the key to this whole case." Wolfe nodded slowly. "It also explains why Professor Van Der Berg had to die. If he'd decoded this genealogical information, he would have known that Kellerman, Lady Catherine and Eduardo Vega all had legitimate claims to the treasure. But why would that get him killed? Because Dr. Ashford said quietly, according to the manuscript, the three guardian families were supposed to work together. If one family tried to claim the treasure for themselves, they'd have to eliminate the others. I finished. Wolfe stood up and began pacing behind his desk, his hands clasped behind his back. It was a sure sign that his mind was working at full speed. "Archie," he said finally, "I want you to contact Inspector Kramer. Tell him we need police protection for Dr. Ashford, and we need surveillance on Kellerman, Lady Catherine, and Eduardo Vega. You think one of them is planning to make a move?" "I think," Wolfe said grimly, "that Professor Van Der Berg's murder was just the beginning. If someone is trying to eliminate the other guardian families, we may be looking at multiple homicides before this is over." As if to emphasize his point, the phone rang again. This time it was Marcus Kellerman, and he sounded terrified. "Mr. Goodwin," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Someone broke into my shop last night. They didn't take anything, but they left a message. I think they're going to kill me." Kellerman's shop looked like it had been hit by a very selective tornado. Books and manuscripts were scattered across the floor, display cases had been smashed, and papers were strewn everywhere. But as Kellerman had said, nothing appeared to have been stolen. This was intimidation, not theft. I'd brought Mars with me this time, figuring that if someone was targeting the guardian families, I might need backup. The Doberman padded through the wreckage with his nose to the ground, occasionally pausing to examine something that caught his attention. Kellerman himself was a wreck. His hands shook as he showed me around the shop, and he kept glancing nervously at the windows, as if expecting another attack at any moment. "Tell me about the message," I said. He led me to his desk in the back of the shop. Pinned to the wall above it was another piece of parchment with the same medieval script we'd seen before, along with what appeared to be a family tree drawn in red ink. "It's my genealogy," Kellerman said, "going back to the 13th century. But look at this." He pointed to several names on the tree that had been crossed out with heavy black ink. "These are all members of my family who died under mysterious circumstances over the centuries." I studied the parchment. The family tree showed the Kellerman line stretching back 27 generations, with branches spreading across Europe and eventually to America. But scattered throughout the genealogy were black marks, deaths that seemed to cluster around certain time periods. "What's the pattern?" I asked. "Every few generations, when someone got too close to discovering the treasure, members of the guardian families would start dying. Look here. 1387, 3 deaths. 1456, 5 deaths. 1623, 7 deaths. Each time, it was members of families connected to the monastery of San Marcos. And you think the same thing is happening now?" "Professor Van Der Berg wasn't the first," Kellerman said. 6 months ago, a genealogist named Rodriguez was found dead in his apartment in Madrid. He'd been researching the Vega family history. 3 months ago, an English historian named Morrison, Lady Catherine's cousin, died in a car accident after announcing he'd found new documents about the Corona Mortis. I made notes while Mars continued his investigation of the shop. The Doberman had found something near the back door that seemed to interest him. He was sniffing at a small pile of dust that might have been plaster or stone. "Kellerman," I said, "what do you know about the other guardian families?" "Not much. My grandfather told me stories about the treasure when I was young, but I always thought they were just fairy tales. It wasn't until Eduardo Vega contacted me 6 months ago that I realized they might be true." "Vega contacted you?" "He said he was researching the guardian bloodlines and had identified me as a descendant of the original Kellerman family. He wanted to know if I had any family documents or artifacts from the medieval period."
And did you?
Kellerman hesitated, then walked to a safe in the corner of his shop. He spun the combination and pulled out a small wooden box. "This has been in my family for generations," he said, opening the box to reveal another silver medallion, similar to the one that had been left on Wolfe's desk. "My grandfather said it was connected to the monastery somehow, but he never explained how." I examined the medallion. It bore the Kellerman coat of arms and was clearly very old, but otherwise it looked unremarkable. "Have you shown this to anyone else?" Just Eduardo. He was very excited when he saw it. Said it proved my family's connection to the guardianship. But then he started asking about Lady Catherine Morrison, wanted to know if I'd had any contact with her family. And had you? Not directly, but about a year ago, someone calling themselves a Morrison family researcher contacted me about purchasing medieval manuscripts. I never met them, but we corresponded by mail. I pocketed the medallion after getting Kellerman's permission, then spent another 20 minutes searching the shop. Mars had found traces of what appeared to be stone dust near several of the damaged display cases, suggesting that whoever had broken in had been carrying something made of stone or plaster. On the way back to the brownstone, I stopped at the Plaza Hotel to check on Lady Catherine Morrison. The desk clerk informed me that she had checked out that morning, leaving no forwarding address. Her suite was already being prepared for the next guest. That was interesting. First Eduardo Vega had bought a plane ticket to Madrid, and now Lady Catherine had disappeared. It was starting to look like the Guardian families were either running away or preparing for something big. I found Wolfe in his office, reading what appeared to be a treatise on medieval Spanish history. Dr. Ashford was gone. Wolfe had arranged for her to stay at a safe house until we could sort out the threats against the Guardian families.
Any progress?
Wolfe asked when I filled him in on Kellerman's break-in and Lady Catherine's disappearance. Some. I've got Saul watching Kellerman's shop, and I put out alerts on Lady Catherine and Eduardo Vega, but I think we're missing something important. Such as, why now? These Guardian families have been around for 7 centuries. Why are they suddenly turning on each other? Wolfe set down his book and studied the silver medallion I'd brought from Kellerman's shop. Perhaps, he said slowly, because something has changed. Some new information has come to light that makes the treasure more accessible than it's been in centuries. The manuscript Van der Berg found? Possibly. Or perhaps someone has discovered the location of the treasure itself. Before I could respond, Fritz appeared in the doorway looking worried. "Excuse me, Mr. Wolfe," he said. "Inspector Kramer is here, and he has several other policemen with him. They seem very upset about something." I went to the front door and found Kramer on the stoop with 4 uniformed officers and Agent Morrison from the FBI. The federal agent was holding what appeared to be a search warrant. "Kramer," I said, "what's the occasion?" "Step aside, Goodwin. We have a warrant to search these premises." "For what?" Agent Morrison pushed past me into the hallway. "Stolen artifacts, conspiracy to traffic in illegally obtained antiquities, and possible involvement in international art theft." "That's a lot of big words," I said. "Care to be more specific?" "Marcus Kellerman was found dead in his shop 2 hours ago," Kramer said grimly. "Shot twice in the head, execution style. Before he died, he apparently called the FBI and claimed you and Wolfe were involved in a conspiracy to steal medieval artifacts." I felt like someone had hit me in the stomach with a sledgehammer. "That's impossible. I was just at Kellerman's shop this morning. He was alive and scared, not planning to accuse us of anything." "Maybe," Morrison said. "But someone used his phone to call our tip line an hour after you left. The caller identified himself as Marcus Kellerman and said Nero Wolfe was the leader of an international art theft ring. As the federal agents began their search, I could hear the 5 Dobermans moving through the house, agitated by the presence of so many strangers. This was exactly the kind of situation we'd been trying to avoid. Law enforcement interference that would prevent us from solving the case. But as I watched Morrison and his team work, I began to realize that someone was playing a very sophisticated game with us. Kellerman's murder, the convenient phone call implicating Wolfe, the timing of the federal search, it all felt orchestrated. Someone wanted us out of the way, and they were using the law to do it. The search lasted 3 hours and turned up nothing more incriminating than Wolfe's collection of rare books and my .38 revolver, which was properly licensed. But the real damage wasn't the invasion of our privacy. It was the time we'd lost while the real killer consolidated their position. Agent Morrison was clearly disappointed by the lack of evidence, but he wasn't ready to give up. "This isn't over, Wolfe," he said, as his team prepared to leave. "We'll be watching you." "I'm sure you will," Wolfe replied dryly. "May I suggest you watch more carefully? You might actually prevent the next murder." After they left, I did a quick check of the house to make sure nothing had been damaged or removed. The 5 Dobermans had retreated to various corners during the search, but they emerged now to resume their patrol patterns. So I said, settling back at my desk, "Who do you think killed Kellerman?" "Someone who wanted to eliminate him as a rival for the treasure," Wolfe replied, "but also someone clever enough to use his death to implicate us in the crime." "Lady Catherine or Eduardo Vega?" "Possibly. But there's a third possibility we haven't considered." "Which is?" "That there's a fourth player in this game. Someone who's not a descendant of the Guardian families, but who knows about their existence and is using them against each other." Before I could respond, the phone rang. It was Saul Panzer, calling from his surveillance post near Kellerman's shop. "Archie," he said, "you need to get down here. I think I found something the police missed." "What kind of something?" "Evidence that Kellerman didn't make that phone call to the FBI." I grabbed Mars and headed for the village, leaving Wolfe with the other 4 dogs and strict instructions not to answer the door for anyone. The last thing we needed was another visit from federal agents while I was trying to gather evidence. Saul met me in the alley behind Kellerman's shop. The building was still cordoned off with police tape, but Saul had found a way to examine the back entrance without disturbing the crime scene. "Look at this," he said, pointing to marks on the doorframe. "Someone forced the lock, but they did it from the inside." I studied the scratches and gouges around the lock mechanism. Saul was right. Whoever had broken the lock had been standing inside the shop, not outside. "So Kellerman let his killer in through the front door," I said. "That's what it looks like." But here's the interesting part. Saul led me to a dumpster behind the building and pulled out a plastic evidence bag. "I found this in the trash." Inside the bag was a cell phone, not the kind of modern device most people carried, but an older model that looked like it had been used recently. "Think it's Kellerman's?" I asked. "That's what I thought at first, but look at the call log." Saul showed me the phone's display. The last call made had been to the FBI tip line, just as Agent Morrison had described, but the call had been placed 45 minutes after the coroner estimated Kellerman's time of death. "So someone else made the call," I said. "Someone who wanted to frame Wolfe for Kellerman's murder." Gets better. I traced the phone's purchase records. It was bought 3 days ago with cash at an electronics store in Midtown. The sales clerk remembers the buyer, a well-dressed woman with an English accent. Lady Catherine Morrison. It was starting to make sense. She'd killed Kellerman, then used a throwaway phone to implicate Wolfe in the crime. But why? What did she gain by getting us out of the picture? I called Wolfe from the alley and filled him in on what we'd discovered. "Interesting," he said. "But it raises more questions than it answers. If Lady Catherine killed Kellerman, where is she now? And what does she plan to do about Eduardo Vega?" "Maybe we should ask Vega directly," I suggested. "His flight to Madrid doesn't leave until tomorrow morning. He might still be at his hotel." "Do that. But be very careful, Archie. If Lady Catherine is eliminating the other Guardian families, Mr. Vega may be her next target." I left Mars with Saul and took a cab to the village hotel where Eduardo Vega was staying. The desk clerk confirmed that Vega was still registered, but when I knocked on his door, there was no answer. The hotel manager, a thin, nervous man who seemed impressed by my private investigator's license, let me into Vega's room. What I found there made my blood run cold. The room had been ransacked, but not in the same methodical way as Kellerman's shop. This looked like the scene of a struggle. Overturned furniture, blood on the carpet, and signs that someone had been dragged toward the window. But Eduardo Vega was nowhere to be found. I called the police, then spent the next hour answering questions from detectives who seemed more interested in my presence at the scene than in finding the missing man. By the time I got back to the brownstone, it was nearly midnight. Wolfe was still in his office, reading by the light of his desk lamp. The 5 Dobermans were arranged around the room in defensive positions. Clearly, they sensed the danger that was closing in on us. "No sign of Vega," I reported, but his room looked like a battleground. Either he's dead, or someone worked very hard to make it look that way. Which leaves us with Lady Catherine Morrison as the only surviving Guardian. If she's really behind all this. Wolfe was quiet for a long moment. His fingers drummed on his desk blotter. Finally, he looked up at me. "Archie, there's something about this case that's been bothering me from the beginning. The coincidences are too neat, the timing too convenient." "How so?" "Consider the sequence of events. Professor Van Der Berg finds a manuscript that supposedly reveals the location of a medieval treasure. Within days, he's murdered. Dr. Ashford comes to us, claiming to be a concerned colleague, but turns out to be working for Lady Catherine Morrison. Eduardo Vega appears as the mysterious foreign gentleman, then disappears. Marcus Kellerman is murdered, just as we're getting close to the truth." "You think someone's orchestrating all of this?" "I think someone has been planning this for a very long time, and I think we've been dancing to their tune from the moment Dr. Ashford walked through our door." Before I could ask what he meant, the lights went out. The power outage wasn't an accident. Someone had cut the electrical lines to the brownstone. In the sudden darkness, I could hear the 5 Dobermans moving into defensive positions throughout the house, their claws clicking on the hardwood floors as they took up stations at strategic points. I drew my gun and moved toward the office door, but Wolfe's voice stopped me. "Stay here, Archie. Whoever has come calling tonight will find us when they're ready." "How can you be so calm about this?" "Because a woman's voice said from the doorway, 'He's been expecting me.'" The voice belonged to Dr. Margaret Ashford, but when she stepped into the office carrying a battery-powered lantern, she looked nothing like the nervous academic who had first visited us. Gone was the frightened demeanor, replaced by cold confidence. In her free hand, she held a small automatic pistol pointed directly at Wolfe. "Dr. Ashford," Wolfe said mildly. "Or should I say, Dr. Margaret Ashford Morrison." She smiled, an expression that transformed her face entirely. "Very good, Mr. Wolfe. I wondered how long it would take you to figure it out." "You're Lady Catherine's sister," I said, the pieces finally clicking into place. "Half-sister, actually. Same father, different mothers. Catherine got the title and the family estate. I got the brains and the ambition." I could hear the dogs moving in the hallway outside the office, but they hadn't entered the room yet. Diana was smart enough to wait for a signal, and the others would follow her lead. "So there never was a Lady Catherine Morrison," Wolfe observed. "Oh, there was. But she's been dead for 6 months, a climbing accident in Switzerland that I arranged very carefully. I've been using her identity ever since, playing the role of the wealthy collector, while my real identity remained above suspicion." "And Eduardo Vega?" "Eduardo was exactly what he appeared to be, a descendant of one of the Guardian families, and a very greedy man. He was quite willing to help me eliminate the competition in exchange for a share of the treasure." "Was." "Past tense, Mr. Wolfe. Eduardo served his purpose, but he became too ambitious. He's currently resting at the bottom of the Hudson River." I shifted slightly in my chair, trying to get a better angle on Ashford without alerting her to what I was doing. If I could distract her for just a moment, I might be able to signal the dogs. "So you killed Professor Van Der Berg, Marcus Kellerman and Eduardo Vega," I said, "all to claim the treasure for yourself." "I eliminated obstacles," she replied calmly. "Hendrik was getting too close to the truth about the Guardian families. Kellerman was useful for authenticating the manuscript, but he would have demanded a share of the treasure. And Eduardo thought he could double-cross me." "What about the federal agents?" Wolfe asked. "Agent Morrison and his team. Real FBI agents, but they're investigating art theft, not murder. I made sure they got anonymous tips about international artifact smuggling to keep them busy. The Morrison name I gave, Agent Morrison, was carefully chosen, similar enough to Lady Catherine's family name to cause confusion, but different enough to maintain my cover." "Very clever," Wolfe said. "But you made one crucial mistake." "Did I?" "You assumed that the treasure of the dead monks actually exists." For the first time, Ashford's confident expression wavered. "What do you mean?" "The manuscript Professor Van Der Berg found was genuine, as were the references to the Corona Mortis, but the treasure itself, the crown of thorns supposedly hidden by the monks, was destroyed centuries ago." "You're lying." "Am I? Tell me, Dr. Ashford, what happened to the monastery of San Marcos after it was sacked in 1248? I could see her trying to work through the historical timeline, and I realized that for all her planning, she hadn't done her homework on the monastery's ultimate fate. "The monks rebuilt it," she said, but her voice lacked conviction. "No," Wolfe replied. "The monastery was abandoned. The surviving monks scattered to other religious houses, and the building fell into ruin. Any treasure that might have been hidden there would have been recovered by the monks themselves when they evacuated. But the manuscript is a medieval fraud, Dr. Ashford, a clever forgery created in the 14th century to support the claims of various Spanish noble families to lands and titles. The references to the Corona Mortis were added to give the document religious authority." I could see the doubt creeping into Ashford's eyes. She'd built her entire plan around the assumption that a priceless treasure was waiting to be found, and Wolfe was systematically destroying that assumption. "How do you know this?" she demanded. "Because I spent this afternoon researching the actual history of the monastery while you were busy eliminating witnesses. The records are quite clear. San Marcos was never rebuilt after the 1248 attack. The site remained uninhabited until the 18th century, when a Spanish archaeologist excavated the ruins and found no trace of any hidden treasure. That was when I made my move." While Ashford was focused on Wolfe's explanation, I whistled softly, the signal I'd trained the dogs to recognize as a command to attack. Diana burst through the office doorway like a black thunderbolt, followed immediately by Caesar and Mars. Ashford spun toward them, raising her pistol, but she was too late. Diana hit her in the chest, knocking her backward into the bookshelf, while Caesar clamped his jaws around her gun hand. The pistol went off once, the bullet burying itself harmlessly in the ceiling, before Ashford dropped it with a scream of pain. Minerva and Apollo appeared in the doorway, completing the circle of snarling Dobermans that now surrounded our would-be killer. I retrieved the pistol and switched on the emergency lighting system. In the sudden glare, Ashford looked smaller and more pathetic than she had in the darkness, just a middle-aged academic whose greed had driven her to murder. "Call Inspector Kramer," Wolfe said calmly, as if having armed killers in the office was a routine occurrence, "and an ambulance for Dr. Ashford's hand." As I reached for the phone, Ashford looked up at Wolfe with hatred in her eyes. "You're wrong," she said, through gritted teeth. "The treasure is real. I have proof." "What proof?" "The real manuscript. The one Hendrik found wasn't the original, it was a copy. I have the authentic document, and it contains information that your precious archaeological reports never found." Wolfe raised an eyebrow. "Where?" "Hidden in my apartment, along with other documents that prove the Corona Mortis was never destroyed. The monks didn't hide it at San Marcos. They moved it to another location before the monastery was attacked."
Where?
But Ashford just smiled and refused to say another word. By the time Inspector Kramer arrived with his team, we had Dr. Ashford secured in the office under the watchful eyes of all 5 Dobermans. The EMT who treated her hand confirmed that Caesar's bite had done no permanent damage, though it would be several weeks before she regained full use of her fingers. Agent Morrison showed up 20 minutes later, looking frustrated and confused. "So she's not really Lady Catherine Morrison?" he asked for the 3rd time. "No," I explained patiently. "She's Dr. Margaret Ashford, who killed the real Lady Catherine Morrison 6 months ago, and assumed her identity to gain access to collectors and dealers in medieval artifacts. And the art theft ring doesn't exist. She fed you false information to keep you distracted while she eliminated her competition for the treasure." Morrison looked like he was getting a headache. "What treasure? You just told me the treasure doesn't exist." That was when Wolfe spoke up from his desk, where he'd been sitting quietly during the initial round of questioning. "Actually, Inspector," he said, "I believe Dr. Ashford may be correct about the existence of the Corona Mortis, not in the form she expected, but as something far more valuable than gold or jewels." Kramer sighed heavily. "Wolfe, please tell me you're not about to send us on another wild goose chase." "Not at all. But I think we should examine Dr. Ashford's apartment before we conclude this case." An hour later, we were standing in Dr. Ashford's Upper East Side apartment, while police technicians searched for the documents she'd claimed to possess. The apartment was expensively furnished and meticulously organized, the home of someone with both money and obsessive attention to detail. They found her private safe, hidden behind a reproduction medieval tapestry in the bedroom. Inside were dozens of documents, photographs, and what appeared to be genuine medieval artifacts. But it was the manuscript at the bottom of the safe that caught Wolfe's attention. Unlike the copy Dr. Ashford had first shown us, this document was clearly much older. The parchment was darker, the ink more faded, and the illuminated letters bore the unmistakable signs of genuine medieval craftsmanship. "This is authentic," Wolfe confirmed after examining it with a magnifying glass. 13th century, almost certainly from the monastery of San Marcos. "Can you read it?" Kramer asked. Wolfe studied the Latin text for several minutes, occasionally referring to a dictionary he'd brought along. Finally, he looked up with an expression of genuine surprise. "Gentlemen," he said, "Dr. Ashford was correct. The Corona Mortis was not destroyed when the monastery was attacked, but it's not what any of us expected." "What is it?" I asked. According to this manuscript, the Corona Mortis was not a physical crown at all. It was a collection of documents, the complete records of the Inquisition's activities in northern Spain during the 13th century. The room went quiet as we absorbed this information. The monks of San Marcos were not guarding a religious relic, Wolfe continued. They were protecting evidence of corruption, murder, and theft committed by church officials during the Inquisition. The treasures was documentation that could have destroyed the careers and reputations of some of the most powerful men in medieval Europe. "And where are these documents now?" Morrison asked. "That's the remarkable part," Wolfe replied. "According to the manuscript, the monks didn't hide the documents in Spain at all. They smuggled them out of the country and gave them to a trusted ally for safekeeping." "Who?" "Sir Edmund Morrison, Lady Catherine's ancestor. The documents were brought to England and hidden in the Morrison family estate, where they've remained for 7 centuries. I stared at Wolfe. "So the real treasure has been sitting in an English manor house all this time?" "Apparently. And if these documents still exist, they would be invaluable to historians studying the medieval period. Not gold and jewels, but something far more precious, the truth about one of the darkest chapters in church history." Agent Morrison looked skeptical. "You're telling me that people have been killing each other over old papers?" "People have killed for less," Kramer observed. "But these aren't just old papers. If they contain evidence of corruption in the medieval church, they could be worth millions to collectors and museums." "There's more," Wolfe said, continuing to read the manuscript. The monks included detailed instructions for finding the documents in the Morrison estate. Maps, coded references, even architectural drawings of hiding places. "So Dr. Ashford really could have found the treasure," I said. "If she hadn't been so focused on eliminating her competition," Wolfe replied. "The irony is that she probably could have negotiated a legitimate purchase of the documents from the Morrison family, if she'd approached them honestly instead of resorting to murder." As we prepared to leave the apartment, I found myself thinking about the 5 people who had died because of Dr. Ashford's obsession with the Corona Mortis. Professor Van Der Berg, the real Lady Catherine Morrison, Marcus Kellerman, Eduardo Vega, and Lady Catherine's cousin in England, all victims of one woman's greed and ambition. "What happens to the manuscript now?" I asked Wolfe as we headed back to the brownstone. "It will become evidence in Dr. Ashford's trial," he replied. "After that, it should probably be donated to a museum or university where scholars can study it properly." "And the documents in England?" "That will be up to the Morrison estate's executors, but I suspect they'll want to examine the family archives more carefully after learning about this connection to medieval history." As we climbed the steps to our front door, I could hear the 5 Dobermans inside, welcoming us home with excited barks and the sound of claws on hardwood. It had been a long, complicated case, but it was finally over. "One more question," I said to Wolfe, as we entered the office. "How did you know Dr. Ashford was really behind all the murders?" Wolfe settled into his chair and picked up the small orchid he'd been tending that morning. It seemed like a lifetime ago. "Several things," he replied. "Her story about being followed was too convenient, designed to make us sympathetic to her situation. Her knowledge of the manuscript's contents was too detailed for someone who'd only seen it briefly. And most importantly, she knew details about the other Guardian families that she shouldn't have possessed unless she'd been investigating them for some time." But you let her walk right into our office with a gun. I wanted to see how far she'd go with her deception, and I knew the dogs would intervene if necessary. I settled behind my desk and started typing up the case notes. Outside, the October evening was crisp and clear, and for the first time in days, I felt like we could relax our guard. The treasure of the dead monks had been found at last, not gold or jewels or a mystical crown, but something far more valuable, the truth. And Dr. Margaret Ashford would spend the next 20 years in prison, thinking about the real treasure she'd destroyed in her quest for imaginary riches. As for the 5 Dobermans, they'd earned their keep once again, proving that the best security system in the world isn't electronic. It's 5 well-trained dogs who are absolutely devoted to protecting their territory and their pack. I finished my typing and looked over at Wolfe, who was absorbed in examining his orchid. "So," I said, "what's our next case?" But Wolfe just smiled and continued tending to his flower, content in the knowledge that justice had been served and the mystery of the Corona Mortis had finally been solved.